take number 500 because I do not know, I truly do not know how to film this review. Anyway, hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today is a review that I have been putting off filming for the past 4 months. Because I have no clue how to structure this review, I have no clue how to talk about this series, and I'm having a lot of issues. So if I'm a bit rambly today, I am very sorry. But today's review, you probably have read it already in the title, is of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. Now, you were always intended to see this review on this date, because from the very beginning I had intended to upload this review on the day the trailer drops for the Wheel of Time Amazon show. And the reason for that is very simply put, because first of all, I think I can help more people with that, because this review is intended to maybe help you decide whether or not you want to pick this series up. And second of all, very simple reason, views, because, you know, I think The Wheel of Time is gonna be in a lot of search bars today. So yeah, I had always intended to drop this review today. However, I hadn't originally intended to film, edit and upload the review on the day of the trailer dropping, which, you know, is fun, it's fine. We're fine, it's good. But yeah, anyway, let me try to start this review in a comprehensive way. So this series, the reason why I think it's hard for me to talk about this series is because this series is a series that on an intellectual level I can appreciate. I can appreciate what Robert Jordan does with a lot of his characters, with a lot of his plot, with his world building and so on. However, for me personally, most choices Robert Jordan made in this series did not work for me. So my personal enjoyment of the series was, I wouldn't say it was low, but it was definitely mediocre, and it was decreasing, not increasing. Yeah, the opposite of increasing is decreasing. Decreasing as the series went on. So while I would say I had higher enjoyment of the first few books, the last few books I really didn't care about anymore. What that means, however, is that if I were to structure this the way I normally structure my reviews, so saying the things I didn't like first and then going into the things I liked, the things I didn't like would far outweigh the things I did like. And to be honest, in this very specific case, I don't think that is fair to the series, because I don't think the reason why I didn't like the series, as I said, was because Robert Jordan is an incapable writer, but just simply because his writing choices did not work for me. Sometimes you have that with books. Sometimes you have that with books that are perfectly fine, that are perfectly good, that might even be masterworks, but they don't work for you specifically. Another author I have that with a lot, for example, is Terry Pratchett. And Terry Pratchett, I think what I've heard of his books that I haven't read, I think does some absolutely unique things within the fantasy genre and is an absolute master, or was an absolute master at what he did. I just don't like absurd fiction. So similar case here, although this is not absurd fiction. So the way I want to structure this review is I will talk about some things that Robert Jordan does with his characters, with his writing, with his world building, with his plotting and so on. And then I will talk about whether or not those aspects of the series worked for me, and also why these aspects worked for me or why they did not work for me. And then at the very end I will go a bit into summarized thoughts, and if I think the series is worth picking up for someone who is interested in getting into the Wheel of Time, what types of readers I think would be interested in this series. Because, you know, if you have a trilogy, you're more easily picking it up, and even if you just feel mediocre about a first book in a trilogy, you know, it's just 3 books, it's whatever. However, The Wheel of Time is 15 books, so it's quite a commitment. And yeah, might be harder to decide whether or not to pick this series up. Usually at the beginnings of my series review, I will go into a little bit of a summary, and then I will also tell you all the installments in the series. I won't do either for this review because, first of all, it's just really hard to summarize the Wheel of Time, but still very quickly in terms of summary for the first book. This book is set in a world where you kind of have two halves of the magic power. You have the male half and you have the female half. And long ago, the shadow, the darkness, the Dark Lord, whatever, you know, that type, the big evil, was captured, was caught, was imprisoned. However, during this imprisonment, the male half of the magic was tainted. Because of that, all men who can do magic slowly go insane. Now, there's a prophecy that this big evil thing is once again rising. It's coming again, and there's only one person who can defeat it once and for all. That person is a man. However, as I just said, all men who can do magic go insane, and that man who would have to imprison or destroy the evil is a man who can do magic. Now, at the very beginning of the first book, we follow a bunch of kids from this little rural village who have to go on a journey, and they might have something to do with defeating the shadow. So yeah, that's just a very confusing, very short summary of the first book. And in terms of installments, I won't go through all 15 books. The thing I will tell you is that the first book is The Eye of the World. The last book is A Memory of Light. The last two books, also for those of you who don't know, were not written by Robert Jordan, because Robert Jordan sadly passed away before he could finish the series. So the series was finished by Brandon Sanderson. However, before his death, Brandon Sanderson did sit down with Robert Jordan, so it was kind of finished in the vision of Robert Jordan. And I believe the last chapter or the last few chapters were also still written by Robert Jordan. And then you have one prequel book, which is New Spring, which I read after book 10, and generally speaking, it is recommended to read it after book 10 or 11. After book 10 was fine for me, and so yeah. Now, I cannot tell you which of the 15 books I liked the most. Actually, I think I can tell you. I think I liked New Spring the most. But of the 14 books of the main series, because I gotta be honest, all books just kind of blur together for me, and I do not remember what happened in which book anymore. So now that we have 10 minutes, almost 10 minutes of introduction, let's finally get to my thoughts on the Wheel of Time. So let's start. Where shall we start? I think we're gonna start with the characters, because I think overall what most people would say is that character work definitely is Robert Jordan's strong point. The series very much focuses on characters more so than actions or plot. There is a lot of plot, there's 15 books for fuck's sake, but mostly we follow the characters and we follow their inner turmoil. And that is where Robert Jordan is very, very good. Like, he really, really goes into the characters. He looks at what motivates them. He looks at what moves them. He looks at what troubles them. And he just explores that very in depth, especially with our main character. I mean, there's like a lot of POV characters, but I would say the main character is still Rand, especially with him. He is our chosen one type, he's our chosen one trope, and Robert Jordan really looks at what that does with Rand. It really looks at how it kind of makes him fall apart, how he struggles with having this huge prophecy on his shoulders. And so I think generally speaking, if you're a character-focused reader, as opposed to maybe a plot or world building focused reader, which there's still things for those readers in the series, but especially if you're a character focused reader, I think you're more likely to enjoy the series than not. I just happen to be the rare character focused reader who didn't enjoy the series. The reason why I think that is because the character exploration that I just talked about doesn't just happen on the level of the main characters, but I think it's done throughout with all the characters, and you kind of get POVs all over the spectrum. You get POVs from the dark side, you get POVs from the good guys, you get POVs from people where you're like, are you good guys? Are you bad guys? I'm not really sure yet. You get POVs from people where you're like, okay, you're the good guys, but I don't like your motivation, or I don't like the way you wanna get to your goal or whatever. So there's just such a big variety of characters, and there's also such a big variety of female characters, which with series like The Wheel of Time that were written in the 90s and earlier, definitely like does not happen that often. So yeah, generally I think if you're a character-focused reader, I think this series has a lot to offer. My issue mostly was that I didn't like the characters. So now the question is, did Robert Jordan's character work for me or not? On an intellectual level, yeah, it did, because I saw all that. I saw all that I just told you about. On the other hand, I really didn't care for any of the characters, or almost any of the characters. The first book was the most, where I had like 2 or 3 characters that I enjoyed following and that I ended up falling in love. But most of those characters I ended up falling out of love over the course of the series, and by the end of the series there were only like 1.5 characters that I still cared what happened to them, and where I still cared, you know, how they're feeling and everything. So yeah, I mean, you can have stellar character work, but if as a reader I don't fall in love with the characters, that's kind of a problem. However, from talking to a lot of people, that's mostly a me problem, so I do think you can ignore that aspect of it, or, you know, get into the series, start it, and see how you feel about the characters yourself. My issue, why I had problems with most of the characters, was less to do with like the personal motivation and the personal goals of the characters, but more to do with the interpersonal relationships and how character dynamics were done, how especially gender dynamics were done, because I was really not a fan of the gender dynamics in this book. Just was a lot of issues I had with that, and that's what we're gonna talk about next, because interpersonal character relationships, by the way, the light just changed because I think the sun just vanished. So interpersonal relationships, I also do think generally that they're very realistically done. Like, there's a lot of things the characters don't talk about. There's a lot of things where characters keep secrets. There's a lot of things where characters just assume things about other characters. And there's a lot of times issues where characters don't show each other how much they care about each other, and there's problems arising from that. However, a lot of the character dynamics you could boil down to the miscommunication trope. And not done in the worst way it could be done, where it's like, just talk about it and the problem would be out of the way. No, it's not like that. But over 15 books, it still really got on my nerves that characters would not talk to each other, even though they had very good reasons for not talking to each other. But I am a reader. I don't, in my books, always want the most realistic thing or the most, you know, this makes the most sense thing. Sometimes I just want things to happen because they're satisfying. And I want things to not happen because I find it unsatisfying if things play out in a certain way. And so that was where my issue was with the character interactions, because I just got so annoyed with all of the characters at some point, because I was just like, just talk to each other, damn it. I don't care if it doesn't make sense for your character to tell this other person this thing right now. I just, please talk to each other. So yeah, I think if you like very realistic writing, then this could be a good series for you. But if you're someone who wants character relationships and character dynamics and characters in general to move forward and to change a lot within their books, then I don't think this is the right series for you generally. Because Robert Jordan has 15 books time to, you know, expand on character relationships, develop character relationships, develop characters, have character developments, character arcs, and he does take that time. But that also means that it seems to be going at a snail's pace. And if you're not someone who enjoys that, then you're like me and you don't enjoy that. As simple as that. So yeah, once again, I do think that like on a technical level it is expertly done, and that Robert Jordan just made choices. These choices just really did not work for me. And the one thing where I'm like actively criticizing it, even though I know there's a lot of people who do enjoy it, is I did not like the gender dynamics, because it relied a lot on people thinking the other person is stupid and wouldn't understand anything that they said anyway, and so it's fine to just tell them to do something and expect that something to be done. And while it was also the case quite a bit on the side of the men towards the women, that was especially the case when it came to women dealing with men. And I don't know, it just, there was a lot of characters taking away agency from other characters, and that just made me really not be a fan of those characters. And in the end, for me, it just ended up feeling like two characters who were a couple. I don't know, like there wasn't even any affection or love between those two characters, or two characters who were supposedly childhood friends. Like they didn't act like friends towards each other. And that's not to say that friends don't have conflict a lot of times, and that maybe friendship or relationships, there's not things that happen within that relationship where for like some reason within certain interactions there's like agency taken away, or that you just tell someone else to do something without explaining it to them, or misunderstandings or whatever. But it felt like those were the only types of interactions, and like there wasn't any warmth left in the relationships, or we didn't focus on the warmth. And sure, that could also be down to the fact that, you know, this series is set in troubled times, so you don't really have the time to show interactions how they would interact, you know, in non-life or death situations. But generally speaking, I'm just someone who loves to see caring relationships, and not that the people in the relationships in the series don't care about each other, but you know, it just didn't feel caring a lot of the times. So yeah. Then the last thing in terms of character interactions, character dynamics and relationships is relationships. The relationships, Robert Jordan's relationships are horrible. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it as it is. I don't like them whatsoever. There was not a single relationship, oh, that's a lie. There was one relationship that I got behind. But aside from that one relationship, there wasn't a single relationship that I found believable the way it was built. It was mostly just like, you know, you met once on page, and then in the next book, when you meet for the next time, suddenly you're in love and you're professing your love to each other. What the fuck is going on? I am so confused. When it comes to relationships, there's even a lot of hardcore Wheel of Time fans that I have seen that are like, yeah, no, relationships aren't Robert Jordan's strong point. But since there isn't a lot of focus on relationships anyway within the book, it's mostly fine, I think. Although there is one relationship where I feel like consent was taken away from one of the characters, like not in a rape type of way, but in a being in this relationship type of way, where even though one of the individuals in the relationship, where even though they wanted to be in the relationship and they did like the other person, it still felt like this other person took away some choice from them, and it made me really uncomfortable, like really, really uncomfortable. Also, one last thing I remembered in terms of characters, an issue I had with the characters personally is there were a lot of characters, which I usually don't have an issue with, by the way. But I think by the end of the series there's like over 200 named characters. I believe I read something along those lines. And the issue for me came when, first of all, there's a lot of characters who have very similar names, which can get kind of confusing, and which can get especially confusing which was the case with me, by book 8 or 9, maybe even earlier, book 7, you don't really care about remembering the names anymore, especially of the side characters. And by book 7 or 8, I have to be honest, I started skim reading, which for me, skim reading, I can still get a lot of information out of it. But yeah, the character names weren't part of that information that I got out of it. So by the end of the series, it just turned into a vicious cycle of with the characters, and I'm just saying this for transparency, not because I think that's anything to do with Robert Jordan's series, but I do think I want to be transparent in how I read with this series specifically. But it turned into a vicious cycle for me where, you know, I didn't care about the characters overly much anymore. Because of that, I didn't try to remember anymore who was who and who was on which side and who had which motivation. Because of that, I had less of a clue what was going on anymore, because I didn't know who was who anymore, which made me even care less to try and find out who was who anymore, and just turned into a vicious cycle, you know, which, I don't know, just was my thing. But next, let's move on to plot. There's a lot of it in this series because, you know, it's a 15-book series, and it's the type of series where you go, oh, this is a short book, it's under 700 pages. Or maybe even, oh, it's a short book, it's only 750 pages. So yeah, there's a lot of pages to fill, and because of that, there is a lot of plot. Now, personally, I don't think that it's that hard to follow the plot, to be honest. When it came to the plot, most of the issues I had with what I just said, that I just didn't care to remember the character names anymore, so I didn't know exactly who was who anymore. But I don't think it's a hard plot to follow. I don't think it's like very intricate, very intense, which by the way isn't a negative thing or anything. I think it's actually quite a good thing that Robert Jordan managed to write a series that is this long without making it overly convoluted, and with still making it clear what the plot is, what the goals are, and so on. And I didn't feel like we got too lost in subplots. There were a lot of subplots, and I'll get to those later on, but generally speaking, it wasn't convoluted. The goals were very clear throughout the series, and I just sat down on something, I don't know. The goals were very clear from the beginning, and we didn't really get lost in subplots to the point where the final goal was lost, you know, where you just had books in between that just didn't work towards the final goal. However, something I still do think is that I don't think 14 books were necessary to tell the plot. First of all, I feel like, especially there's this slog thing that's book 7 to book 10, I believe, or book 11. Well, no, not book 11. Book 7 to book 10. So there's 4 out of 14 books that are called the slog. I didn't find them any more sloggy than the other 4 books that came after the slog, because at that point, as I said, I honestly didn't care anymore, and I pretty much only finished the series to be able to say that I finished the series. But during the slog, there are some times where it feels like it's the same plot over and over again, and like the same actions are repeated a lot. And then also there are issues with POV characters, main POV characters from the first few books, just completely vanishing for a whole book or almost a whole book, which just makes me like, you know, if you can afford to have a POV character not be in a whole book, then maybe there's a bit too much plot and maybe you should shorten something. And overall, I think personally I'd have enjoyed the series way more if it had been like 7 to 8 books. I think that would have been enough, to be honest, to tell the plot, because I think there are quite a few subplots that, even though they didn't make it so, you know, the main goal was lost, I do think there are some subplots that aren't necessary. There's one in specific that I'm thinking of that I won't tell you which it is for spoilers, but that wasn't even properly resolved by the end, which part of the reason, I have to be honest, it wasn't resolved is because I think originally Robert Jordan might have intended to have like a spin-off series following that subplot then, but yeah, I just didn't think that subplot was necessary, and pretty much from the very beginning, whenever that subplot came up, I just was like, I'm not interested, I'm just gonna start skim reading even more than I'm already skim reading. But yeah, it's once again an issue of like, could some of the things have been resolved more quickly? Yes, they definitely could have, but also I don't think that would have been in Robert Jordan's vision, because he makes things very realistic, and a lot of political stuff especially, you know, it's not realistic that things get resolved very quickly, so he just took 5 fucking books to resolve certain things. And if you're a reader who enjoys that, once again, I think this is the perfect series for you. If you're a reader like me, who sometimes puts satisfaction above the most realistic thing or the thing that makes the most sense, maybe not the ideal thing. Things I did, however, really appreciate in the plot of The Wheel of Time is that, first of all, Robert Jordan does not spend a lot of time on action, which I very much like. I've told it before, I'm not the biggest fan of action. Mostly I just enjoy action scenes, or I think action scenes should be like most sex scenes, for example. I think they should be there to make us get to know the character better, or to further character interactions, or to further the plot also. But like, I don't need overly detailed, especially one-on-one action scenes. And especially with that, Robert Jordan does not bother with that. He does not even say things like he swung his sword or whatever, but mostly he just gives the moves names that seem like names from Chinese martial arts. And I'm just gonna say seem like Chinese martial arts, because I don't know how much of that is from actually Chinese culture and how much of that is just Hollywood. But you know, I think like one of the movements is called like heron taking off, or those types of names. So I did really appreciate that, because I felt like it added something to the world building while not spending overly much time on action scenes. And if you're someone who very much enjoys action scenes, then sadly he cannot offer that for you. But if you're someone like me who isn't the biggest fan of action scenes, then I think that's a very good thing. So the last thing I want to talk about is the world building, and generally I have to say the world building is probably my favorite part of the series. I really like the magic system. It's, I would say, rather a soft magic system. Like, there's not the biggest boundaries to what the magic system can and can't do, but it's also not like, you know, just swishy swashy whatever we need in the moment and that's what the magic does. But you know, it's not Allomancy from Mistborn, you know, there's not very hard boundaries. So I did really enjoy the magic system. I also really enjoyed the concept with, you know, the male half being tainted and the female half not being tainted. It was actually the thing that made the character interactions or the gender dynamics most bearable at the very beginning of the series, although it did start getting on my nerves then, as I said. But you know, it made sense in that context why women have such a feeling of superiority towards the men, especially the women who can do magic. So I thought it was a really good idea, and it really nicely, you know, combined magic with society, which not a lot of writers do. So I really did enjoy that. Then in terms of world building, I thought that Robert Jordan gave his different cultures very distinct feelings. Also, something in general with the world is Robert Jordan knows how to make you feel distant. So it wasn't one of those fantasy books where, you know, there's like miles upon miles between place A and place B, but the characters are there in like the snap of a finger, and really suddenly, no, they actually had to travel, and had to travel for like multiple books sometimes. But yeah, in terms of the cultures, I really felt like we got a feeling for the different cultures. There were of course some where we focused more on and others that we just got glimpses into, but generally speaking, did really like that. Something that just seemed off to me, but maybe that's just you know, because I don't have feelings for space, but sometimes the world seemed a bit too small for the amount of different cultures that was there, like for the amount of like vastly different cultures that was there. It wasn't like there were like generally the same cultures with just some regional differences. No, it was like completely different cultures, but you know, in a space that to me seemed to be about as big as Europe, Maybe it's bigger though. Maybe it's just because, you know, Robert Jordan, The Wheel of Time has one of these maps that is very much based on Europe, or roughly based on Europe. But yeah, just, I don't know, the spaces seemed a bit not enough for me. Then an issue I had with the world building was there were some cultures that had slavery. Didn't like how that was dealt with always, but again, I'm not gonna go into spoilers because spoiler free. And then lastly, the thing that I can gush about for ages with Robert Jordan is his one culture, the Aiel, because it is legitimately the best conceptualized culture that I have ever read about in a fantasy series. I mean, with any fantasy series that is written by a white person with cultures that are based on non-Western cultures, there can always be a discussion about cultural appropriation, what is or isn't cultural appropriation. I have made a video on that. I have very torn feelings on that because, to be honest, it's fantasy. I do not know how to, you know, gauge what is cultural appropriation, what isn't cultural appropriation. I am also white, so I don't think I should be the person to judge. But the Aiel are one of the best conceptualized cultures ever. I mean, there is the little issue that they're desert gingers, which after I think millenniums living in the desert seems a bit unrealistic that they'd still be like about as white as I am. But aside from that, they are so realistic to the point that I want to make a video just on them. And first of all, also go into the inspirations behind the Aiel, because there are a lot of aspects that Robert Jordan took directly from other cultures, like not just being inspired by certain dynamics in other cultures, but like directly taking rituals and so on from other cultures, which again, that's where the discussion of cultural appropriation can come in or not. But putting that aside, I think that might be one of the reasons why the Aiel feels so real. The Aiel are one of the few fantasy cultures where I feel like, you know, I could actually sit down and analyze them anthropologically. And that's what I maybe want to make a video on at some point. So yeah, that's that. Also, I just very much appreciated that at a time when, you know, the stereotype for desert living races or fantasy races was mostly very badly done orientalistic stereotypes of Middle Eastern cultures, the Aiel do not fall into that, and I very, very much appreciate that. So that's also something, like with series that were written in the 90s and earlier, even in the early 2000s, I'm just a lot more lenient when it comes to gender stuff, and also when it comes to what's the other thing? Cultural stuff. Yeah, I'm a lot more lenient when it comes to cultural stuff. However, the thing I have to say, a little rant, and that's, by the way, not on Robert Jordan, that's completely on the readers. Because something that Robert Jordan does is he codes some of his characters as queer. And he's praised for that a lot. Like, he's praised for it a lot that he, for example, for some of the women uses pillow friends, which obviously, if you have any reading comprehension, means that they fucked. At least in their youth. Like, you know, they were college lesbians or whatever. So he does that. However, he is never explicit. And he's praised a lot by fans for doing that because, you know, it was the 90s and it just was a different time and whatever. So, yeah. And I mean, for a white author in the 90s, for a white male author in the 90s, I do think he was very good at doing that. But the thing is, the thing that bothers me so much is how much he's always praised as someone who did that when no one did that at the time. When I have read like almost every single adult high fantasy book that I have read that was written by a woman, there's at least direct explicit mention of queerness, or there are actually characters who are queer in that series. So there were tons of people who already put that in their books at that time. So can we please stop praising white men for the absolute minimum and act like things haven't been done until they have been done by white men? Can we please stop doing that? That is my little rant, but that has nothing to do with Robert Jordan. I appreciate that Robert Jordan did what he did, and I do agree that for a white man writing in the 90s, he wrote very progressively. However, we also can basically agree that he finished the series in the late 2000s. Like the last book that he wrote before he died was in the late 2000s. So I have read tons of adult high fantasy books that were written earlier than that have queer main characters. Cushiel Start, which I think is up there. It's up there. Has a bisexual main character, and it was published in 2003. Which, okay, is later than 1990. However, again, Robert Jordan, The Wheel of Time took very long. He could have included some queer characters in later books. Then, Servant of the Empire, which should be over here right now, has explicit mention of lesbianism. There isn't a lesbian character, but it has explicit mention of lesbianism or sapphicism. Sapphic characters. It has explicit mention of sapphic characters. And that one was written in the 80s. So let's please stop praising white men for the bare minimum. Please. So yeah, that was basically my review for the specific things in that series. Now let's sum it up and let's talk about whether or not I think it's worth reading. And I have to say, I think if you're a reader who wants to know where a lot of things in Western fantasy come from, I think this is a great series to pick up. If you're a character-driven reader who does not mind when things take a very long time to develop, I think this is a great series for you. I think this is also a series where you shouldn't decide whether or not you want to continue on with the first book. And I know that might be weird to say, because for me it's also like, you know, time is too short to read books that you're not sure about. And most of these books, as I said, are between 800 and 1,000 pages long. But I do think you can only really know whether this series is for you when you read up to book 4. If up to book 4 you're like me and you're like, you know, I'm enjoying this well enough, I guess, but not really feeling continuing on with the series ever. I'm not really, like, I don't feel the urge to pick up the next book right away and so on. I don't feel the urge to pick up the next book maybe even in a year or something. I think 4 books is enough to read. I think you get a good feeling for what the series is about. And I think after book 4, if you're still not into it, then just set it aside, because that would be 10 more books to read, you know, it's a lot of time that you'd spend on a series that you only feel mediocre about. But yeah, that's all the things I think that I wanted to say about the series, that I wanted to say in this review. And so if I could help you in deciding whether or not to pick up this series, maybe before or maybe after you watch the first season of the TV show, tell me in the comments down below. If you for some reason have watched this really long review, spoiler-free review, and you have read the series, tell me in the comments down below whether or not you agree with my assessment, not my assessment, but like my thoughts on the series, and whether or not the things I talked about worked for you or didn't work for you. But as I said, it's like, it's a series where I appreciate it and where I think it's not incapably written or anything, but Robert Jordan made choices, and those choices just might not work for everyone. And so yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month that actually have explicit queerness in them, like the books, will be left linked down below as well. In September we're reading not the Secret Bargain, The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!